In every generation, it seems like God raises up certain individuals to fight, to say, this is not okay with me, and to call the rest of us to do better. Well, we're going to hear one such story today of Christa Brown and her fight to hold the SBC accountable for the sexual abuse crisis. It's riveting. I so admire Christa. And I think as you hear her story, the question that's going to occur to all of us too is, well, what can we do? What is our role in all of this, and how can we help? At least I hope that's what you'll take away from it. Welcome to the Bare Marriage Podcast. I'm Sheila Ray Gregoire, and here at Bare Marriage, we like to give healthy, evidence-based biblical advice for your sex life and your marriage. And a lot of that depends on the church that you grew up in. And so we'll be talking about wider issues in the church today. And I'm so glad that you've joined us. Before we turn to Christa, of course, I want to say thank you to those who make it possible for us to do what we do. And so a special shout out to our patrons. And when you give money, even just $5 a month, it helps support us. It helps keep the podcast and the blog going. Because as we have grown over the last few years and as our impact has grown, staff costs and all kinds of costs have grown as well. And we spend so much time just trying to get new material out there. So when you support us, it really does make a difference. And it's our patrons who allowed us to do our huge study recently for our marriage book that's coming out in the spring, The Marriage You Want. So they funded the survey for that. And it's just a fun place where you get access to a Facebook group, which is kind of like my safe space online. So we will put the link in the podcast notes to patreon.com/baremarriage, where you can join too. And of course, as the end of the year is coming sooner than we think, if you would like to give an end of the year donation and get a tax deductible receipt within the United States, we are raising money for a lot of other initiatives that you'll hear about in a couple of weeks on the Bare Marriage Podcast. And so you can give through the Good Fruit Faith Initiative of the Bosco Foundation. And the link is in the podcast notes. And as always, remember to mark the podcast 5 stars and review it. Review our books wherever you read them. Great Sex Rescue, She Deserves Better. It helps other people see us. And now, without further ado, here is our interview with Christa. Well, this is going to be a fun one because I have the opportunity again, and I've had a few of these lately, but to interview someone that I have known for years online. But this is the first time we've actually spoken in real life, kind of. So I have Christa Brown with me, who she was a lawyer. She is a huge sexual abuse advocate, specifically about the SBC Church, and you're an author of this amazing book, which I can see on your stand, and I have it right here too, BaptistLand. So hello, Christa.
Hello, Sheila. I'm so glad to get to visit with you.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. And you have been, you're just a pioneer. You know, I think I started speaking in this area probably around like 2019. You've been going since 2006.
Well, and even before that, with my own case. So,
hmm
2004 or so. Yeah,
Yeah. And you were abused in an SBC church as a teenager,
correct.
and you tried to do something about it and nobody cared.
That sums it up. And it was much to my surprise. I
Mm,
really truly believed that things would be different now, that people would have changed and gotten smarter and wiser since when I was a kid, and that people would want to help me. I
mhm,
believed all of that. Um, But after communicating with the church and having the church threaten to sue me, and just a preemptive strike, just out of the blue, really for no
mhm.
reason. And then 18 Southern Baptist leaders later, 18 in 4 different states, no one gave a flip. No one was going to do anything. Um, and as a mother, I found that really troubling.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to get into your story and what how you see the SBC and what has happened over the years. But where I see our stuff mixing and coming together, synthesizing, I don't know what the right word is, but you speak specifically about abuse within church circles and specifically in the SBC. I'm very much a supporter and I want to elevate your voice, but I come at it from a slightly different perspective, which is my perspective is it's the teachings inside the church which allow abuse to flourish. And I know you agree with that too. So it's like we come at this same problem from different angles, right? And
Right.
so I thought because of that, we could start by listening to a clip that has gone viral on social media by an SBC, megachurch pastor, Josh Howerton, that was taken a few weeks ago, where he was talking about the danger that little girls pose. So let's just listen in.
To fight. This is really interesting. The book of Ephesians says to you, men, that if the devil literally physically appears to you, it says what you need to do is stand firm against the fiery darts of the evil one. But then the same book says to flee sexual immorality. Do you know what that means? If you go out of one of our campuses, get to your car, and the literal physical devil, horns and tail and fang, whole standing right there, you need to stand up and bow up, and the Bible's going, hey, fight. But if you go out there and it's like some shady little girl in a miniskirt, run, Forrest, run! You are no match for this enemy.
Well, that's a take, isn't it?
Yes, shady little girls. And I think even many years ago that I was one of those shady little girls that they want to talk about. And not much has changed. The teachings are still the same
Yeah.
because I
I'm
was certainly blamed for what was done to me.
Yeah, because he's literally saying, okay, look, guys, if you see the literal devil, you stand there and fight the devil. But if you see a shady little girl in a miniskirt in a church parking lot, so you see a shady little girl in a miniskirt in a church parking lot. I don't even know how a little girl can be shady. Like, a little girl is a little girl, right? But if you see this girl, she is more dangerous to you than the literal devil. So you need to run, Forrest, run, because you are no match for her.
Right,
So she is your enemy. She is so dangerous. She is the problem.
right. And I was literally told that I had harbored Satan. I mean, and this was after 7, 8 months of the pastor sexually abusing me as a kid. I had harbored Satan. Now,
Mhm.
some people have asked me about that and said, well, didn't they say, that you had demons or something? No, they could have said that, but what they actually said was Satan himself. You harbored Satan. Um, that's pretty frightening.
Yeah. And
And I
that's what
never even wore a
happens.
miniskirt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
But that's what happens when pastors normalize
Yes,
seeing little girls as dangerous. When pastors normalize, the idea that a man cannot possibly stand up to the temptation of a child wearing whatever it is she's wearing,
right.
they are enabling people overlooking abuse. Then your pastor can tell the music director at your church what he's doing, but it can be seen as your fault, not the pastor's
Exactly.
fault.
Exactly. And it was seen as my fault. I was a temptress.
Yeah,
Yes. I was a kid. I was a temptress.
yeah.
I was even made to kneel in his office while he stood over me, purporting to cast Satan from me,
Mhm,
essentially a sort of exorcism.
mhm.
Now, that can sound pretty bizarre to a lot of ordinary people who might listen to that, but for someone like me, raised in a faith group that preached and taught a literal hell, um, that was terribly frightening to imagine that I had Satan within me.
Yeah. And it's heartbreaking your story is heartbreaking. I mean, your story just makes me want to weep. But your story is one of how many? We don't even know.
We don't know, but I
Thousands upon
suspect,
thousands.
yes, yes.
And nothing's being done.
There's the linchpin. Nothing's being done. Not
Yeah.
really. No.
Yeah. So I don't think a lot of my listeners really understand what's been happening in the SBC. So I thought, today since you are the expert in this area, you could walk us through what's happened. So, and in your book in BaptistLand, which when did it release? It's fairly new, isn't it?
Yes, May 7th was the release
May
date.
7th.
Not too much.
Okay. So this is new. It's a lovely memoir. It's heartbreaking too because I hadn't known all the rest of your story. I had known about the church abuse, but I hadn't realized um that you yourself came from such an abusive family. Not just abusive parents, but abusive sibling relationships as well.
Right. And I think in some ways that a lot of that is a reflection. I mean, my family was enmeshed in Baptist land culture. I mean,
Mhm.
Baptist land is bigger than the Southern Baptist Convention. It's a very influential culture that these teachings take hold in. And those kinds of relationships of domination, um, which I think is part of what the theology of
Mhm.
Baptist land promotes, those kinds of relationships of domination then take hold in other ways between
Mhm.
husband and wife, spouses, between uh, preachers and their congregation, between older siblings and younger siblings. Those patterns of domination can take hold.
Right, because it's all about who can be in power, who can have control.
Yeah.
And that's the way that you see your worth, is if you have control over somebody else. And yeah, not a good way to do society, not a good way to do church, not a good way to do family, but it certainly is happening. And maybe we'll get to this in a minute, but um or actually I'll just talk about it now. But one of the things that really struck me was that in many ways you were the perfect victim.
I was.
Like you come from a family where you're already abused, where it's clear no one's going to listen to you if you speak up and say, "Hey, I'm upset about something." No, you're just supposed to be quiet. What's wrong with you? Why are you complaining so much? Um, and predators notice this stuff.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. For me, the way I was raised, abuse was simply normalized. Don't cause any trouble, keep quiet. All of that was normalized, which did indeed make me a perfect victim. And also, I would say that, oh my gosh, I was so devout, and my faith was everything. And that too, I mean, that is what got turned against me as a weapon. And that too rendered me vulnerable. It was because I was so faith-filled
Mhm.
that rendered me an easy target for this pastor.
Which I think is what makes it so doubly evil or triply evil. I don't even know what the word is, but that they attack the one who is the most submissive to God, who is the most dedicated to God,
Right.
because they know that that's the one that they can manipulate in these situations. It's just so evil.
Yeah.
As Christa's been talking about how the SBC needs to be held accountable for these things, I think the thing that goes through a lot of people's heads is, I would love to call my church to more. I would love to deal with some of the toxic teachings that are in my church space, but I don't know how to do that. And so we have a toolkit that can help you. It's kind of like a short form of all of our major findings from the Great Sex Rescue and She Deserves Better. So you can print it out, or you can email individual PDFs which say, hey, here is the problem with the obligation sex message. Hey, here's the problem with the modesty message to teenagers. Hey, here's why you shouldn't be saying that every man struggles with lust. And here are the repercussions when you do. And so much more in that toolkit. All of our one sheets, our rubrics, so much more. And it's also pay what you want. So you can pay as little as $3, or you can pay as much as you want to support us. So you will find the link to the toolkits in the podcast notes. My daughters used to say, because they were in circles in their teenage lives where there were some predators among the girls, who preyed on the girls in their midst, and they always said they would never go after me. The predators would never go after us because we would raise such a stink, and they knew that Keith and I, like their parents, were so involved that we would see it. And instead, the girls that were targeted were often the ones who were overlooked by their family, who were, and what I got in reading your memoir too is that has long-term consequences, because when you're used to not valuing yourself, when you're used to, I am the problem, everyone around me sees me, I am the problem. I'm not supposed to make any noise. I'm not supposed to speak up. I'm not supposed to inconvenience anybody. My very existence is an inconvenience to so many people. When that's what you're raised in, and a lot of people are,
Yes.
um, then it is really hard to speak up to your church. Which is why so many people don't do it until their 50s.
Right. And then even when they do speak up, I mean, I did tell the music minister who was my piano teacher. That didn't help. That made things worse. And
Yeah.
he told me to never speak of it again.
Mhm.
But as you say, I mean, my story is just one of thousands. I mean, there are so many kids. I mean, yeah, I was raised in a dysfunctional family, but so are a heck of a lot of other kids.
Yes. Yes.
And and that's what makes it so awful.
Yeah, and I do want to stress, obviously, not everybody who was abused came from a dysfunctional family. It's just that we know that there are certain elements in people's lives that can make them more attractive to predators, but it doesn't mean that all victims were raised in dysfunctional families, obviously.
No, and also I would say that all children are inherently vulnerable
Yes.
because predatory people
Hmm.
seek prey and they are
Yeah.
very, very wily and manipulative.
Yeah.
Some children are more vulnerable than others, but I think all children are vulnerable.
But what really struck me as I read your memoir, and we'll get to the SBC stuff in a minute. I'm still processing some of the emotional outpouring of reading your memoirs, but that the responsibility to fix this stuff has so often been put on the victims who have already been traumatized in so many ways. And that's not fair. Like,
Yeah,
you shouldn't have to be the one to fight for this. You've
right.
already gone through enough.
Well, I didn't step into it thinking that I would still be doing this all these years
Mhm.
later, still trying to bring this truth to light. In the beginning, I thought it would be a really short-term endeavor because I truly believed that people of faith in this faith community would care. But I was wrong. And here we are all these years later. I no longer hold any hope that they are
Mhm.
going to make significant efforts toward meaningful reform. But I still think that there is value in exposing this truth of the reality of where we're at with the largest Protestant faith group in the United States.
Yeah. And I want people to understand that too. I know we have a lot of listeners in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, all over Europe, the Caribbean, et cetera, Africa. But the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant. It's not exactly a denomination, but we can call it a denomination for the purposes of this. It's more a cooperative group, they say, of autonomous churches. And they really like the word autonomous. Um, who decide to cooperate for purposes of missions and outreach and things like that and education. And so it's I don't know, there's several. How many churches are there in the SBC?
About 47,000.
47,000. Okay. And members, what, about 13 million?
That's where they're at now. 13.2 was the last I saw.
Okay. So this is a lot of people. This is a lot of people in the US. And so with that background, let's start sketching out what happened. So in 2006, you approach your, or 2004, you approach your
Right.
old church.
Right. I did. And I thought that they would want to help me. The same music minister who had known about it when I was a girl, and he had been my piano teacher when I was a girl, he was still there. And by this point in time, he had raised a daughter of his own. I just was, this was someone who knew me well as a kid.
Mhm.
He was my piano teacher. I had my piano lessons in the church sanctuary. Um, I just thought for sure that he would be glad to hear from me, that he would be glad to know I was okay, that he would want to help me to make sure that the guy who was the youth minister that he couldn't hurt anyone else. Boy, I have never been more wrong about anything in all my life because the church immediately responded back full force. They went straight to their attorney, full force,
Mhm.
um, and basically threatened legal recourse against me if I talked about it.
Right.
Um, and that was, at the time, it did sort of set me back on my heels. I was really stunned. Um, but with hindsight, I have come to see that that was kind of a blessing in disguise
Mhm.
because the reality of the position they were coming from was so very clear. I mean, my little brain, I can
Mhm.
do all sorts of things to kind of cast a rosy glow on stuff and deny the reality of things. I'm capable of all that. But that was the kind of response that there was no mistaking
Hmm.
where they were coming from.
Right. And this was in Texas. So
Yes.
this SBC church was in Texas. You ended up talking to the Texas Southern Baptist, what is it? Association? I don't know.
Yeah, it's called the Baptist General Convention of
That's what
Texas,
it is. Yes. Hmm.
Texas Baptists.
Hmm.
Um, and actually, they're considered one of the more moderate state conventions that is affiliated with the
Hmm.
Southern Baptist Convention. And there again, I thought these people would help me, but they
And
did not.
what you were asking for was to make sure this pastor wasn't still in the pulpit somewhere, wasn't still able to hurt anyone. You were asking for them to look into make sure there weren't any victims, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that's what I was asking for. And I had also written to the Southern Baptist Convention, and they had written me back saying that eventually, saying that he was not in ministry anymore, which at the time, once again, that sort of, okay, fine, everything's all right. That set me back for several months because I believed them. I believed them. And of course, that turned out to me not to be true. He had been working in First Baptist Church of Atlanta, which is one of the largest churches of the Southern Baptist Convention. And from there had moved on to a prominent church in Florida, a very prominent church. It was impossible to believe that people didn't know that he was still in ministry. That was just something I
Mhm.
personally could not believe. I think they did know.
Yeah. Wow. And then in 2008, when was it that you asked the SBC executive to do a registry? Because that was back
The first time I asked them to do a registry was 2006. Yeah.
2006. Okay.
And originally by letter, certified letters, because I
Hmm.
wanted, proof that they had gotten my letters.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, they responded with hostility, saying, communication between us will not be positive or fruitful. Um, but I continued to press for that. And then the first sidewalk press conference I did outside Southern Baptist Convention headquarters in Nashville. That was also in late, I think September 2006.
Yeah. And remember, again, all she's asking for is for a registry so that people who have credible accusations,
Right,
who work in churches or volunteer in churches, that there would be a registry so that other churches wouldn't hire these people. That's all Krista was asking for.
right,
That
right.
doesn't seem like a big deal.
No,
That seems kind of like, yeah, we should be doing that.
right. And it's not unprecedented. I mean, at this point in time, I mean, this has been something, that's been progressing, but by now, uh, Catholic dioceses across the United States of America have released over 6,000 names of priests who are credibly accused of abuse. Those are not priests that have been criminally convicted, priests that have
Hmm.
been determined to be credibly accused. So it's not unprecedented. This is something that can be done. And again, I would say, Catholics are certainly a very, very low bar.
Hmm.
Um, and but Southern Baptists are falling far below it.
Yeah, and then over the next few years, I know you were called some pretty bad names. What did Paige Patterson say about you back then?
H. Patterson called me an evildoer and also said that I and other child sex abuse survivors were just, who were calling attention to this, said that we were just as reprehensible as sex criminals.
Right.
Now you
Hmm.
imagine you're telling child sex abuse survivors that
Hmm.
they are just as reprehensible as sex criminals.
Yeah.
Uh, that I think was in 2008, as I recall. Yeah.
Right. And at the same time, you're writing a blog, Stop Baptist Predators. I don't think it's still up, but you had it for quite a few years where you kept your own database. You were talking about this stuff. You had hundreds of posts, and you kept fighting, but nothing much happened. until, and I mean, maybe I'm reading into this, but I would put the big thing that happened that got the ball rolling was the Houston Chronicle article.
Oh, I would too. I mean, I would say nothing much happened institutionally, but
Right.
things were happening with individuals as a growing chorus of other people's voices kind of
Mm-hmm.
joined me. And then by the time the Houston Chronicle was working, there were a great many more survivors who were willing to speak out. But
Mm-hmm.
yes, 2019, the Houston Chronicle and San Antonio Express News, a joint investigatory report called Abuse of Faith, a
Mm-hmm.
dynamite piece of work, which was absolutely stunning. Of
Yeah.
course,
Thank you, Robert Downen. Yes.
yes, exactly.
Thank you,
It
Robert.
wasn't
Yes.
anything that Southern Baptist Convention leaders didn't already know. As Robert Downham himself has said, this
Mm-hmm.
information was out there. They put it all in one place and brought it into the public eye, for
Yeah.
which I remain very, very grateful.
And I will put a link to that article in the podcast notes. It's worth reading. I think it might be behind a paywall at this point, but it's worth reading if you can get hold of it. It really is. And it said that there were 700 sexual predators that they could find. Is that
My
right?
recollection is they said 700. They coalesced 700 victims.
Oh, victims. Okay. Hmm.
Yeah, but there were several hundred Southern Baptist Convention sexual predators that they documented. Yes.
I had an interesting conversation. One of the churches that they called out specifically was Second Baptist in Houston.
Yes.
And I had an interesting conversation with someone who had been on staff there, quite high up. And I was saying to him, like, you guys have to take this seriously. Like, this is serious. You need to get your act together and focus on the victims. And he assured me that none of it was true because he had spoken to the pastors and the pastors had assured him that none of it was true. And I said, but did you talk to the victims? And he said, well, he didn't have to because he knew the character of the pastors.
Ah, there
And
it
I
is
said,
again.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I said, well, you know what? Robert Downen talked to the victims. He looked at both sides. Yeah. And anyway,
And
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. Yeah.
well, in Second Baptist, I forget which way this worked, but Paul Pressler himself was there for a number of years, either before he went to First Baptist or after leaving First Baptist. I forget which came first, but that was a church that held Paul Pressler for a while.
And Paul Pressler has since been revealed
Yeah.
to be a serial um, sexual abuser. Didn't he just pass away or
He did. Yes.
did
Several months ago.
before he could actually get sentenced or something, right? Or
It was a civil lawsuit, not a
oh,
criminal
okay.
lawsuit. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. And he was one of the founders of the conservative resurgence, or not founders, but he was one of the main instigators of the conservative resurgence in the Southern Baptist Church in the 1990s, along with Paige Patterson and some
Yes.
others. And yeah, he was revealed to be a serial predator. Hmm.
Yes. And was absolutely revered.
Hmm.
And the truth is, I think almost anyone would say so. It was kind of an open secret about his conduct. I think there were many people within the Southern Baptist Convention
Hmm.
who had heard talk about his conduct, but everyone, wanted to ride the coattails of the glory of Paul Pressler, and so they all stayed quiet. But this was pretty much an open secret.
Yeah. And then there was Paige Patterson, who did lose his job eventually as head of, was it the Southeastern Theological Baptist Seminary?
Southwestern,
Southwest, he
Southwestern,
was Southwestern? Okay. Because it came out, yes, that he had when a young woman came forward with the fact that she'd been sexually assaulted on campus, he told the security guard to break her down, to break her story down. Yeah,
yes.
so that she would recount. Yeah.
And I mean, we now have also documentation, of him getting her alone in his office, an office
Mhm.
filled with stuffed animal heads,
Yeah.
and and literally working to break her down, to
Hmm.
bully and intimidate her, and a room filled with other men too, who
Hmm.
all stayed silent. We hear these stories of how in complementarianism, how men are supposed to be the protectors of women.
Hmm.
They couldn't even stand up to the likes of Paige Patterson.
Yeah.
when he was bullying this young woman, this young traumatized survivor.
Yeah. So imagine being 18, 19 years old. I can't remember how old she was at the time, but you're called into the president's office, this elaborate, ornate office with, yeah, like you said, you know, deer heads everywhere. There's multiple men, and you're asked to recount everything that happened. And you're asked what you were wearing and if you've been drinking, and all these questions that make it sound like you're at fault. Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah. That's what he did. Along with many other things. Like that's not the only reason he was let go. I mean, there's so many horrid things that have come out about Paige Patterson as well. Yeah, so the Houston Chronicle article, this got everything, all the ball rolling. People started to pay more attention. The Me Too movement became the Church Too movement. A lot was happening on social media. And so at the convention, um, it looked like they might be doing something. So did it start under Greer, where there was um a resolution? What was it, in 2020, 2021? I don't know which year.
Uh, you're probably talking about 2020, but yes, former Southern Baptist Convention President J.D. Greer promised bold steps,
Mm-hmm.
which of course never materialized, but
Right.
that's the pattern. Flimsy promises, even flimsier excuses.
Yeah. So they were supposedly going to create a database. There were several other, and at the conventions over the last few years, there the messengers, which is what they call the delegates that are sent to the convention. And there's like several thousand of them there every year, and the delegates voted overwhelmingly to do the third party investigation the guideposts did eventually, to set up a database to get things going and to really fix things, and yet it hasn't been done.
Right. It hasn't been done. It is 5.5 years now since the Abuse of Faith series
Hmm.
done by Robert Down and Houston Chronicle. It's been 2 years since that independent investigation that you referenced, the guidepost investigation.
Hmm.
More than 2 years since they voted for the creation of a database, and
Hmm.
still there is not a single name on any database.
Yeah, and there's been some really good people, I think, who have tried to be part of this, who have been on the task force, and they thought it was going to go somewhere, and they've now realized it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, a member, in fact, of, um, I mean, there's been multiple committees and task forces. A
Hmm.
member of one of the first task forces um, actually wound up emailing me and apologizing and saying that, that this person, that they were sorry if they had ever given any hope that anything would ever change, because nothing will change. And that was what the realization they came to, a very poignant and sad realization. I know they were sincere in the work that they were trying to do. Um, but to have someone who was actually right there in the thick of it, working on this committee,
Hmm.
saying that, I think it shows you just how hopeless it is that this tentacular multi-billion-dollar institution is ever really truly going to commit to meaningful reform.
And for several years at this convention, so they have this convention once a year where all of the churches send messengers, they get together, they vote on important things. And for several years, sexual abuse was the top issue until this year and last year. And this year, instead, having women pastors was the top issue. And that's what they just really wanted to crack down on women pastors. And so so the main threat that they see in the SBC is not sexual abuse, but it is instead women preaching about Jesus. And yeah, that is the main problem.
That's exactly right.
Mhm.
And yeah, that's a hard realization, I think, for people. And particularly when you consider that this is the largest Protestant faith group in the United States. And even apart from their own numbers, it's a faith group that carries weight beyond their own numbers in terms of their influence across all of white evangelicalism, really. Um, and that this was their priority. Um, while at the same time doing near nothing about clergy who sexually abuse the young and vulnerable,
Mhm.
is just devastating.
Yeah, it really is. But people in the pews do seem to want this fixed. I mean, if you just talk to the average layperson, they do seem to want it fixed. I mean, the messengers did vote for this to get fixed. They did overrule the executive committee, and when the executive committee tried to do different shenanigans so that they wouldn't, have to do it, they were overruled. Like, no, we're gonna do this. So the lay people seem to want it fixed, but it just never gets fixed. It's like the people at the top are really scared of fixing it. And I think that there was an amicus brief that took people very much by surprise when it came out. But can you explain what that was? What?
Yeah, there was a lawsuit in Kentucky, and it wasn't a lawsuit that had anything to do with the Southern
Mhm,
Baptist Convention,
mhm,
um, but several entities, that's what they call them, entities of the Southern Baptist Convention, the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee, Lifeway, which produces all of their Sunday school materials and more,
mhm,
um, Southern Seminary,
mhm,
and the Southern Baptist Convention itself, the whole of the Southern
mhm,
Baptist Convention, filed what's called an amicus brief, which is considered a friend of the court brief. So you don't even have to be involved in the case. You don't even have to be a party to the case. You're a friend of the court, advising the court on what would be good. So the whole of the Southern
Yeah, and
Baptist,
usually people do this, or usually organizations do this when like the outcome of this court case would affect them, and
yes,
so they're going to file this brief because they feel like I have a stake in this case, even though I'm not actually a party to it. And to be clear, the case was a horrific one about a little girl, now an adult, who had been sexually abused, and she wanted people held accountable who had known at the time
yes,
and had done nothing.
institutional accountability,
Yeah.
right.
Hmm.
Um, and so the Southern Baptist Convention kind of put its own weight. And you imagine this is in Kentucky,
Hmm.
where very large part of the population is Southern Baptist, where no doubt many of those judges are Southern Baptists. And the whole of the Southern Baptist Convention puts its weight behind opposing this case.
Hmm.
Now, as you point out, the Southern Baptist Convention, there is another case in Kentucky that is indeed against the Southern Baptist Convention. And this is probably, I think in the brief itself, they even suggested that this was why they were filing it, because of this other case.
Hmm.
So, in order to protect themselves institutionally, they put their whole institutional weight of a 13 million member, multi billion dollar organization behind opposing this other girl's case.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, setting precedent for countless other cases. My point being, they were willing to hurt no telling how many child
Hmm.
sex abuse survivors for the sake of protecting themselves. And they did this all behind the scenes.
Hmm.
While they're there, at the convention and in other public forums, talking about how much they care
Hmm.
to talk, what they're actually doing in actual practice is very powerfully opposing the ability of child sex abuse survivors to seek justice of any kind, particularly as against the institutions that have concealed these kinds of crimes. Um, and the Southern Baptist Convention president himself did all this behind the scenes. Um, Individually, he he said this in one of his own blog postings. He was the person who authorized this
And
amicus
this is
brief.
this is Bart Barber for
Yes,
everyone. Yeah, Bart Barber.
on behalf of the whole of the Southern Baptist Convention, despite resolutions and motions by what the messenger body had done. This is what the president authorized.
And Al Mohler did as well, the
Yes,
president
exactly.
of Southern Seminary. Yeah. So he also
And Bill
signed.
Moeller on behalf of Lifeway, Bill Mandrell on
Hmm.
behalf of boy. Yeah.
And so again, I just want to stress. So and her name is in the press, so I think it's okay to say it, but Samantha Killery, right?
Correct. That was the case.
Yeah, so she just wanted people held accountable who had known about her sexual abuse when she was very young and hadn't done anything. And the SBC stepped in and said, no, don't hold those people accountable.
That's
Don't
right.
give her justice. Don't
That's
give
right.
this woman justice for what was done to her. That's what the
Don't even
SBC
give her
did.
a chance at having justice. Don't even
Yeah,
let her put the evidence on.
yeah.
Yeah.
And they won.
Yes, that's right. They did.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think if you consider the weight and power, I mean, this is exactly why the Southern Baptist Convention did this, because they do carry weight and power.
Mhm.
So it was no surprise that they did win.
And let's remember why they wanted to win, why this was so dangerous to them, and the reason why I think well, actually, I should ask you because I have my own theories, but why are they so reticent to do anything?
Because they're protecting the institution against potential liability risks.
Yeah, it comes
Uh,
down to money. It's money.
it does. Yes, it absolutely does. And there
Mhm.
is another case, which has not, because Kentucky law also has this process of sealing child sex abuse cases. Um, there is another case pending. At this point in time, the pleadings in that case are still under seal, but that is the very case I believe that they fear having all of those
Mhm.
allegations and evidence out into the public, which eventually I think surely they probably will be.
Yeah, because and here's the essential issue, okay? So the SBC says that all the churches are autonomous, that they are just they aren't really a denomination. They just cooperate on things, but that the Southern Baptist Convention itself has no power over individual churches. And so if abuse happens in an individual church, then the Southern Baptist Convention is not responsible. That's what they want people to believe and to hear, and they want that to be the legal precedent. They don't want to be held responsible for what happens in churches. But the problem is that quite often they knew what was happening and they knew that pastors were getting switched from one church to the next where they would go on to abuse, and they did nothing.
That's exactly right. Yes, that's exactly right.
That's what happened in your case. Tommy
Yes,
Gilmore, who abused you,
yes.
went to work for multiple very large churches. Do we really believe there were no more victims? Like,
I don't know.
I don't. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's what makes this all so awful is many high Southern Baptist leaders have known. They have known and they have chosen again and again and again to prioritize money, to prioritize the protection of denominational dollars over the protection of children. Um, as a mother, I just find it unconscionable.
Yeah, I do too. Absolutely. And and then there was the guideposts report. The only thing that I read in it that I hadn't known before, I think most of it I had already known, was the Johnny Hunt story. So Johnny Hunt was a former president of the SBC, and he refused to be interviewed for the Guideposts report, as did Paige Patterson. So, the Guideposts tried to interview as many people as possible who were on executive committees who had done things over the years. And most people submitted to interviews, but a lot, several key people like Paige Patterson and Johnny Hunt did not. But they included a story which they said they believed that it was a credible accusation that Johnny Hunt himself had sexually assaulted a woman who was the pastor's wife. And they described the encounter. And then Johnny Hunt went and sued the SBC for making this public. And in his deposition, it's just unbelievable. I wrote a post about this last week, so I'll put a link in the podcast notes so you can go read it. Um, in his deposition, he said it wasn't adultery because there wasn't intercourse. It wasn't sexual abuse because sexual abuse has to involve intercourse. He said that he didn't kiss her because he only kissed her breasts. He didn't kiss her lips. Like, what is wrong with these people? I mean,
Right. What is wrong with these people? Exactly. Yeah.
like
Uh,
he was the president of the SBC.
and he is still widely sought after as a speaker within
Hmm.
evangelical circles. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we have, one president issuing an amicus brief to make sure that one particular girl never gets the chance to fight for justice. We have this guy sexually assaulting. We have Paige Patterson calling you a Jezebel, um, just because you want people to care about
Yeah.
sexual abuse victims.
Yeah, I was named in the guidepost report dozens of
Hmm.
times. My name
Hmm.
appears in there dozens of times. And the reason it's there so much is precisely because of how terribly the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee treated me, because the guidepost report
Hmm.
was really very narrowly focused on the executive committee, not the whole
Hmm.
of the Southern Baptist Convention. They treated me terribly. They've never made amends or taken any accountability. And I think, people wonder, well, why don't the local churches do more and take more accountability? Well, look at the example that is set at the very, very highest levels, even when it's
Hmm.
fully documented in a multi-million-dollar investigatory report. They don't take any institutional accountability.
Yeah.
Um, the Southern Baptist Convention it has the resources of what would essentially be a mid-level Fortune 500 company.
Hmm.
Now, the average Fortune 500 company, you know, they carry liability risk. It's the very nature of a large institution that there are liability risks that are associated with such a large undertaking. But large secular organizations manage those kinds of liability risks. The problem with the Southern Baptist Convention is they want all the power of being essentially a Fortune 500 company without carrying any of the inherent responsibilities that go with that.
Yeah.
And that's the wrong thing.
Yeah. Um, Another thing that I found interesting in the Guideposts report, was they talked about how when you went to speak, you were finally invited to speak to the executive committee. Was this in the report or did I read this somewhere else? It was in,
I think what you're going to say is in the report. I wasn't
okay.
exactly invited, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were invited to speak and you told your story of what had happened when you were abused. Like you're literally telling these men how you were abused as a teenager. And one of them starts laughing
Yes.
and one of them turns his back to you.
Yes. And if you can visualize this, and he literally got up and rotated in his chair so that he's sitting in the chair backwards so that he can have his back to me. Um, and you've got this room full of men who are the highest leaders in the largest Protestant faith group, and not a one of those other men called that out or said whoa or in any way did anything about that kind of incivility. And you imagine, there I am talking about this, the most traumatic thing of my life, and this is how I'm treated, and no one does a thing. This is what's normal to them.
Yeah. Because you are the problem.
Yes,
You are the problem, Krista. You
yes,
are the enemy. You are Satan,
yeah,
right? That's what they think. That's what Josh Howerton said in that thing, little girls, shady little girls in mini skirts. They're the enemy. Yeah.
right. And to this day, I mean, even for that horrible treatment there by the executive committee, there's been no accountability for that. It's fully documented. There it is.
Hmm.
There's nothing.
Have they ever apologized? Has anyone
No,
high up ever apologized or reached out or said, let's have a phone
no.
call or
Let's see. It was 20, these years. I think it was 2021, maybe 22, when on the convention floor they did pass a resolution of lament and apology, and they named 10 of us survivors. Um, it was very generally worded. It did not acknowledge any specific conduct, certainly didn't acknowledge this conduct toward me. It was very general. I think, at that point, the media pressure was so great that they felt they had to do something. But at the same time, what they did, they didn't draw any attention to the reality of what they had done, of their own conduct.
Yeah, and the fact that they're still not doing anything. And the reason I think their reasoning, if I can put myself in their shoes, is that these sexual abuse survivors are trying to take down the church. We're doing all this great work for Jesus. We are spreading the gospel. We are doing the work of the Lord, and you guys are our enemies who are threatening it. And that's how they see it. Like, we are doing this great work, and you are threatening our great work. And it's like, guys, the work of Jesus is to care for those who've been abused. If you cannot do the work of Jesus by trampling underfoot children who've been sexually abused. It doesn't work that way.
Right. I think that is what they would certainly say is, yes, we're doing all this great work. We don't want to be distracted. We don't want to be distracted from the mission by all of this other stuff. That is what they would certainly say. I think the reality is these are people who sit in control of a great deal of money and resources and power and influence, and they want to keep that status quo.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any hope that things will change?
I certainly don't have hold any hope for the Southern Baptist Convention as an institution. What we see is that their membership numbers are dwindling quite rapidly. I personally think that's a good thing because an institution that doesn't protect children, a faith institution that doesn't protect children, doesn't deserve to have children in the pews. But the hope I see is in the many, many, many more survivors who are now raising their voices, survivors and advocates too. I think there is value in the exposure of this truth. Even if the Southern Baptist Convention never changes and never does a thing, then maybe they will wither and die. But people, over a couple generations, people will know the truth. And they will have been very much on the wrong side of history.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to end with something that I said earlier in the podcast because this really, I might even get emotional when I say this, but it just shouldn't be up to you. You've carried a lot. Reading in the Guideposts report, at one point they listed all the names that you had been called, and it's unbelievable the things that these supposed men of God said about you because you were like, hey, you got to do something about sexual abuse. And the pain that you have endured for years, the pain that so many other survivors, and I can think of many of them that I know on social media too, who have been pushing and pushing and pushing and doing everything they can to raise awareness, and they just keep getting dismissed. The pain of Samantha Killary, who was really bulldozed by the SBC. It shouldn't be on you.
No,
And
it shouldn't.
and which doesn't mean we're not grateful, but this needs to be a wake-up call for everybody. Like, things are not going to change until it's not just on you, until it becomes our problem. You shouldn't have to be a sexual abuse survivor to care about clergy sexual abuse.
Right. No, I really appreciate your recognition of the weight of that, Sheila. I truly do, because it has been a great weight and taken a toll. There's no question that this has taken a toll in my life, but I would also say that I feel in many ways I've been more fortunate than many survivors, and I was aware of that from way back when. I mean, I was an attorney in my career. I was able to afford good professional counseling. I always felt that I had some resources, as awful as it all was.
Mm-hmm.
I always felt that I had possibilities to speak that perhaps many, well, I knew I did, possibilities to speak that many, many survivors didn't. And so I felt some obligation to try to do that and still do. But you're right. This burden that is this additional weight that is put onto survivors to be the ones to keep bringing this to light.
Mhm.
Um, no, it's wrong.
Yeah, and the institutions are not going to change until the people in the pews stop supporting it the way it is, till they stop accepting the status quo. And I want to say to Southern Baptist members, there are other Baptist cooperatives that you can join. It's the SBC is not the only one. And a lot of churches have left the SBC in order to cooperate with other conventions. Um, there are other options.
Yeah.
And when you look at the history of slavery, when you look at what they're doing now, people, you just need to ask, is this really the best way that we can do? And do we really want to export? Because one of the reasons the SBC cooperates is for missions. Do we really want to export all of this to the third world?
Which is what they're doing. Yes.
Is that really the way that we're going to spread the kingdom of God, is by exporting these structures and these institutions into the third world? Is that really the way to do it?
And
Um,
Sheila, my recollection is I think that you wrote one of the best threads I remember seeing on this of the impact of why people should give some serious thought to walking away from such a faith group when it becomes apparent that change isn't happening, that reform isn't happening. I think you wrote a thread on that, and the essence of it, as I recall, I'd have to go back and dig this out and hope I'm not, speaking out of turn here, but as I recall, the essence was, by your very presence, your continued presence within this communicates to other people that this is a safe place. And it's not. It's
right.
not.
Because it's not just about how the SBC treats sexual abuse victims, and sexual abuse survivors, which we've been talking about here. It's also the Josh Howertons giving
Yes.
those messages. It all goes together, right?
Yes.
And and what I said in that thread, if I remember correctly, and I was in the Canadian equivalent of the SBC for quite a while. I've been in churches like this, and I realized one day that by going, I am signaling to all of my friends who don't go to church that this is a safe place because they think I'm safe. They
Right.
like me. They know I'm a neat person. I'm a good mom. I've got a great family. And so if I'm going there, I am lending my reputation to this church. And if I'm paying money and tithing into this church, then I am creating programs that make the church attractive to the community. And if people then go into this church, and if women then go to the pastor and say, "Hey, I'm being abused," and the pastor then tells that woman to submit more and go back to her abusive husband, or if the youth pastor abuses a girl in that youth group and it's covered up, that is partly on me because I was the one who made the church look safe. Even
Yes.
if I had issues with it, even if I thought, well, I can change it by staying, by staying, I am lending my reputation to it and I'm letting it keep going. And I know this is really nuanced, and even in that thread I tried to give some nuance because I do believe that some people might be called to stay for a certain reason. I mean, things always work differently for different people, and I get that. But I had to come to that realization that by staying, I was lending my reputation to it. Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah. I do think people need to weigh that and consider it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, I think one of the things I got at the end of BaptistLand too, which again, great memoir. I think this is the season of amazing memoirs. I've had so many people who've written memoirs on this show lately, and yeah, it's just been a great summer of reading all of these. They're sad. A lot of them are sad, but it made me think about so many different dynamics reading yours and about how abuse and trauma play out generationally and
Yeah.
then how that affects how we experience abuse in the wider society and how we experience grooming and all kinds of stuff. But one of the things you said at the end was that, maybe the way things are going to change is by outside pressure, whether it's from the FBI, whether it's from more reporters, and reporters have done a stellar job. They've really been heroes in all of this. Um, But yeah, let's just keep pressure on social media. Keep talking to your pastor about this. Keep talking to reporters, and just don't feel ever, people, that you need to keep anyone's secrets, any church's secrets. You know,
Right, right.
don't believe victims and stand up for victims, because that's what Jesus did. That's what Jesus did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that Department of Justice investigation is still ongoing. So that's another thing down the road
Hmm.
that we don't yet know what the results of that will be. But
Hmm.
yeah, I absolutely agree. Outside pressure, lawsuits, media,
Yeah.
uh, this is what will continue to bring change.
And remember too, when people file a lawsuit, it isn't them being greedy. Sometimes they're doing it because this is the only way to get the institution to pay attention. And it's
That's
sad that it comes to that. But
right.
yeah.
Yes. No, that's exactly right. And by filing lawsuits, you put documents into the public
Mhm.
record that then allow journalists to report on that. So you
Mhm.
get the exposure of this information, which is
Mhm.
exactly why they filed that amicus brief to try to prevent this
Mhm.
kind of exposure. So yes, I am grateful for not every survivor can, but for those survivors who do, we owe them a debt of gratitude because they are the ones who bring this information to light. Just imagine if Dwayne Rollins had not sued Paul Pressler.
Mhm.
There is so much that we would not know, but it was
Mhm.
that lawsuit that brought so much to light.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of people who are heroes in this, and grateful for you, grateful for other survivors who have stood up. And as we're going out, I want to pick up on one thing that you said a while ago, is they're going to end up being on the wrong side of history. And that's what I would just challenge our listeners to. Do you want to be on the wrong side of history? You know, because you know it's going to be that way. You can't ignore abuse. You can't downplay abuse. You can't call shaded little girls in miniskirts your enemy and not be on the wrong side of history. And how do you want your kids and your grandkids to think about the faith legacy that you leave them? You know, there are healthy churches out there. There are healthy faith communities that care about the abused. And so please find a healthy one and bring life to it. You know, if we all just got together and went and infused the healthy churches with more resources, then those healthy churches would become, bigger instead of these ones. So that's my prayer. So Krista, any last words? Where can people find you? Or
You can find me on Twitter. I'm Christa Brown 777. I also have a Substack, so it's called In Solidarity. So look on Substack, christabrown.substack.com. And yeah, I like engaging with people.
yeah, and I will put the links to those in the podcast notes too. I love that you still call it Twitter and not X. So do I. I just can't do the X thing.
Me
So
neither. Yeah.
no, it's always going to be Twitter to me. Thank you, Krista. And Krista's book again is BaptistLand, which is a memoir of abuse, betrayal, and transformation. And really touching, really insightful. So thank you, Krista.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So grateful to Krista for joining us on the Spare Marriage podcast. And Krista was also one of the people who was featured in the For Our Daughters documentary that Kristen Dumais put out recently. And a few weeks ago, we had Kristen on the podcast to talk about that documentary, For Our Daughters. And I encourage you to watch it. Krista's featured there really well, and a lot of these issues, if you want to learn more about them, are also featured in that documentary. And so listen to that podcast from 2 weeks ago, but even more importantly, watch the For Our Daughters documentary and share it. Another thing that launched just this week on Monday is the Sons of Patriarchy podcast. I think it's going to be like a 36 podcast podcast series that's doing a deep dive into Doug Wilson and the problems with Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho, the church that he is building. It's easy to think that Doug Wilson is fringe, but he's really not. And that's what the podcast series is going to show, is how mainstream a lot of his positions have become. And if you're not familiar with Doug Wilson, thank the Lord, you're very blessed, but you probably are familiar with a lot of his teachings because they are infiltrating in other places. Even Al Mohler, one of the people who signed that amicus brief about Samantha Killary that Christa and I were talking about, the leader of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Even he was recently he was platformed with Doug Wilson at a discussion forum, and he shook Doug Wilson's hand and shared the stage with him, and I had a real issue with that. So he is becoming more mainstream. So the Sons of Patriarchy podcast, they interviewed so many survivors from Doug Wilson's church. They interviewed experts. I'm on 2 of the episodes. I haven't heard what they are. I don't know when they're airing, but I will be on 2 of them. And there's amazing people on them. Kristen Dumais, Karen Swallow Pryor, Tia Levings, Kate West, all kinds of people that have been featured on the Bare Marriage podcast before. Steve Hassan and his Bite model, like people that aren't even necessarily Christian, but they're experts on cults. Anyway, so many really, really good people. So please follow that podcast, share it, because we need this information to get out there so that more people don't get sucked in. So thank you. Together we can make a difference. We can make a difference in the SBC. We can make a difference in the broader Christian world itself, and we can make a difference in our churches. And so pick up our toolkit. The link is in the podcast notes. Keep supporting what we're doing, and let Christa Brown be an inspiration to you, that she took a deep pain in her life and she used it to stand up and fight for justice. And even though the SBC hasn't done a lot yet, Christa's voice has been heard, and God has used Christa to shine a light. And that's important. That's important because it's good to at least let organizations show you who they are. So thank you for joining us. And together, we're going to create a better church, a church that becomes the body of Christ and that reflects Jesus better. And I'm excited to be part of that journey with you. So take care, and we will see you again next week on the Bare Marriage Podcast. Bye-bye.